We had a question coming in from the Rod Favre concerning conference affiliation. I've always said that I felt as though, and I'm not taking any other sports into consideration, not taking academics into consideration, that Notre Dame is the fit for the Big Ten. But again, that's just football related. There are other factors involved. Brian, what do you feel about conference affiliation? You guys have to hear this practically every day. Nathan and I have talked about this a number of times. As soon as you say, I cover Notre Dame or I'm a Notre Dame fan, then comes the onslaught of, you guys need to join a conference. You guys dodge people. You know, you've heard it all, of course.
Well, and then, of course, their first year in the conference, they go undefeated in the regular season and play for the conference championship and lose to a rematch to a team they beat earlier. Look, here's my comeback to always that. Hey, Notre Dame was always an independent. They didn't leave. They didn't change. When Notre Dame won a national title in 1988, Florida State was an independent. South Carolina, Penn State, Miami, they were all independents. They chose to join conferences for financial gain. Notre Dame didn't need to do that. So, you know, you can get upset all you want, but, you know, let's not forget when Miami was the U, they weren't in the Big East. They were an independent. And they traveled all over the country to play teams. That's what I loved about Miami back then is they'd go out and play UCLA. They'd play anybody, any place, any time. And that's what I liked about Bobby Bowden back in the day. Much respected that a lot more than Steve Spurrier, who wouldn't go anywhere. You know, above if it was below 60 degrees, he wasn't taking his team there. But, you know, as far as conference play, look, there's advantages to being in a conference and there's also disadvantages to being a conference. And the same thing for Notre Dame. I mean, you know, when you're in the Big 12, you get a recruit to play. Most teams play a similar style. You can recruit to play against that. Same thing with the SEC and the Big 10. Where at Notre Dame, 1 week you're playing Wisconsin, right? And they're ground and pound. And then 2 weeks later, you're playing USC in their air raid with all those athletes. And then a week later, you're playing North Carolina and their air raid, which is more run oriented. It's a completely different situation, and you've got to recruit to be able to beat all those teams. And oh, by the way, if you're good enough to win all those games, you get to the conference, you get to the playoff, and you got to play Alabama or Clemson. So, you know, this notion that Notre Dame has an advantage by not being in a conference, I think is just, I mean, 2015, Notre Dame is in Boston 1 week and Palo Alto the next week. Who else does that? Nobody in November. So there are certainly go count the miles Notre Dame travels and compare that to Alabama and talk to me about how it's easier playing in a conference. And that stuff matters. So I don't think Notre Dame needs to be in a conference. And if they were ever going to join a conference, I would like it to be the ACC, because I get where you're coming from, Mark, where the Big Ten is the geographical fit. But to me, I don't think the Big Ten is a fit for Notre Dame from a big picture standpoint, from an institution standpoint, from a, you know, what does the Big Ten really do for Notre Dame? You know, so they get a recruiting foothold in Ohio and Pennsylvania and Michigan, where they already have recruiting footholds. Playing in the ACC allows you to play in Georgia, play in Florida, play in Virginia, play in North Carolina. And lo and behold, ever since they started playing in that league back in 2014, all of a sudden you're seeing them get more players from Georgia. They're getting more players from Virginia. They're getting more players from those regions. So to me, it's more beneficial. And I think from an institution, the schools in the ACC are more similar to Notre Dame than the schools in the Big Ten. Not saying that the Big Ten doesn't have good academic schools, but it's 40,000 student academic schools, where Virginia, Duke, those are smaller schools. Those are even the ones that are, you know, Virginia's a public school, but it's more like a private school than it is Virginia Tech or you know, Georgia or Ohio State. So I just think in that regards, the ACC is a much better fit for Notre Dame. And I think the ACC does more for Notre Dame than what the Big Ten would do for Notre Dame. And let's not forget, Notre Dame wanted to be in the Big Ten for years, and the Big Ten said no. So, you know, the Big Ten's the reason Notre Dame isn't in the Big Ten right now. And I'm fine with Notre Dame continuing to say no to the Big Ten for the rest of eternity.
Well, that was a completely selfish statement on my part, just being a college football fan, that geographically Notre Dame's sitting in the middle of Indiana, and they have long-standing rivalries with Michigan, Michigan State, and Purdue, and I would love to see those reinforced, whereas I have no recollection of anything connecting Notre Dame to the ACC.
You mean you don't remember the game against Sean Moore in Virginia back in '89 in the Meadowlands, Mark?
Actually, I do remember that, but it's a bit obscure, but I do remember that. Yes. So that's my thought about Notre Dame. But I have always defended Notre Dame's scheduling approach, because my goodness, you know, when 2018 hit and they made it through undefeated and reached the playoff, people were saying the schedule was a bit light this year. Well, it had nothing to do with Notre Dame's approach to scheduling because it's always loaded. It was that Florida State was down, Virginia Tech was down, Stanford was down, USC was down.
Right.
And then I'm looking at this year's schedule. Yeah, we don't need to defend Notre Dame's schedule. It's one of the top 5 in the nation almost every year.